Assalamu alaikum. Elizabeth, good morning. How are you today?
Hey, walaikum salam. I am doing well, alhamdulillah. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us today. For
Sure.
our audience, Elizabeth, she is going to be discussing with us today having a healthy relationship with food. So I hand it to you, Elizabeth. I'd like you to share with our community who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here today and to discuss this with you. Hey, salam to everybody. If you don't know me, if we've never met before, my name is Elizabeth. I am a health coach and I am the founder of a small company called Soulistic Nutrition. At Soulistic Nutrition, we work with communities and women to better our health behaviors. And through my one-on-one coaching program called Nourish Me, I work with female clients to better their relationships with food so that you can use food to fulfill your soul's purpose. And so part of that is all about emotional eating. It's about connecting with ourselves, our self-esteem. But my work really focuses in this program on the self, and it really overlaps with this type of platform to understand who we are, why we use food the way that we do, and how we can better our health behaviors. So things like how we sleep, how we eat, how we talk to ourselves, all types of wellness behaviors. Um, and as a health coach, what we say is like we're like a guide on the side. I am not a dietitian and I'm not a nutritionist. So I do not do clinical work, like I don't do blood work. I'm not able to give out meal plans or anything like that. A lot of people tend to get these types of professions confused. My work is more on creating health behaviors with an individual or providing community education. So I love doing programs with like masjids, community centers, hospitals, as well as I've been working with Mindful Muslima for the last 2 years as well on their platform to just help us all, reflect and connect with our bodies and our minds and our spirits.
Amazing. So what do you see would be like a very unhealthy relationship with food?
So in my framework, I try to veer away from black and white mentalities and healthy versus unhealthy because in our society, so I'm based out of New York, in the United States. And so here in the West, we tend to be bombarded with so much imagery, with so much messaging about food and about our bodies that in itself can just being in this environment can make us develop unhealthy behaviors. And I use that term loosely, like where we're beating ourselves up over what we eat, where we develop low self-esteem because we're comparing ourselves to the messaging that we see out in the world of models, of marketing images, of now AI images, even, a lot of filtered life. Um, so when it comes to food, what I like to reframe it as, I primarily work with Muslimas, is putting it in an Islamic framework, because that helps us kind of like filter out all the excess noise about, diet culture and good versus bad, healthy, unhealthy, and being like, okay, what is the purpose of food in our life? And how can we use that to fulfill our purpose as Muslimas? So I like to use that framework to then say, okay, using food in a positive way means giving our body its rights. So, how can we use food in a way that is nourishing, that is helpful for our body, minds, and spirit, and that's giving our body its right?
And what would you advise somebody who knows that they are not in control? Or let me put that another way. What did you say to somebody who knows that the way that they are eating and living is not in accordance to where they would want to be? Where would they start?
I like how you reframe that too, right? Like if I'm feeling like very disempowered, even with some of that language, and then reframing it. If you're not like, you want to be somewhere, but you're not there yet. So how can I get there? I feel like even just framing it that way, is really even more empowering. So there's so much that we can do. And there's this term that we use in health coaching called bioindividuality. And that means that each person is unique. So, for example, you and I might eat the same foods, but we're going to look very different and we're going to metabolize those foods differently due to our genetics, due to our environments, due to so many things, even our temperaments, right? If we like and dislike certain foods. And so I want to keep that in mind that when we talk about ideas around health and living, it really is unique to each person's situation. Um, and so taking a broad question like that, where can one start? If you realize, hey, like I'm turning to food in a way that is detrimental. I'm struggling with my energy, my digestion is sluggish, or I'm having a lot of digestive issues, I'm having health issues. Maybe food can be a part of that, right? So getting curious, I think, is a really good place to start. And that's a place that's accessible for almost all people, right? Just getting curious, like what is going on? What are the types of symptoms I'm having? What is my lifestyle like? What are the factors going on, right? Like if you are going through a divorce, if you are really stressed at work, if what are those factors that could be impacting the choices that you're making? And even socioeconomics is such a big thing, right? Of why we make the choices that we do. So is it because you're on a limited income? Are you stressed about money? So when you start looking at our food and wellness behaviors through a lens of curiosity, it helps us be like, okay, what's going on? It also takes the edge off of like so much self-blame. Because I feel like a lot of times when we hear about like diets, it's all or nothing, right? It's like you have to look this way and you must eat this way. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you, right? Like it's very black and white, all or nothing mentalities that can be really, really, really stressful, right? And kind of like prey on our vulnerabilities and insecurities of like, I would love to be desirable. I would love to be thriving and having so much energy and being athletic, right? Like all these like ideals that we see out there, and we're like, we'd love that for ourselves. Um, but a lot of times what gets us into a pickle is like it's all or nothing mentality. It's like you're in or you're out. It's you're eating nothing or you're eating everything. And that can be really hard. And so getting curious of like, okay, what are my behaviors like? What is my life like? I think that's a really good place to start.
Yes. And it really is a vicious cycle because if a person is highly stressed, then they're not digesting properly, they're feeling bloated and fatigued, and they don't feel good, and then their skin might break out and all of this, then they feel even crappier, to put it frankly, that they can't make those changes because they don't feel like vital enough to, come on, let's get with the program. So I see this is where the benefit comes in of actually having somebody to act as a support, whether it's a coach or whether it's even just like a buddy who's going to help objectively, to look at the sort of the pattern in one's life and to make those changes, right?
Yeah, exactly. And with coaching, it really is all self-directed, like it's a client's direction. Like we can make suggestions, we literally coach, like, okay, this might be a good step to take, but it ultimately puts the power back in your hands to decide. And a lot of the skills that we build is about self-reflection and getting to understand your body better, to understand making the connections of like what's going on in your internal world and your external world and how that can affect your decisions. So it definitely does help. And not only for accountability, for like showing up for yourself, but yeah, just being able to fine tune and have somebody reflect back, like, oh, I'm hearing this from you. Like, how does this, what does it hear like? What does it feel like to hear that said back to you?
Yes, so tell us more about a person who really is unhappy with their body, unhappy with themselves.
Yeah, so when somebody is struggling internally, right? It feels like the weight of the world is on you. And when you look in the mirror, it's hard to look yourself in the eye. right? Like you feel so disconnected from yourself. And instead of looking back at yourself with love, with mercy, with kindness, we look back at ourselves with hatred, pointing out all the things we hate about ourselves, all the things that we come up short, whether it's physically or in our behavior. All we do is like kind of talk down to ourselves. And it can create this vicious cycle where if that's the soundtrack in our head, then we tend to repeat behaviors that build a story that solidify that prove I am not worthy of love. I am unlovable, even for myself. I can't love myself because I don't take care of myself, because I look this way, because I treat others this way. You know, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy because in our head, that's either what we've always told ourselves or what others have told us about ourselves. And that can really, that can be one of the hardest things for us to ever confront, you know, that really dark part of ourselves. And that can really affect all of our wellness behaviors too. And something that I like to work with my clients on is thinking about, why are we doing a program to work on wellness behaviors? What is your vision for your life at the end of this? Who would you like to become or work towards, right? What is that person? What is she like? What are the behaviors like? What are the feelings you have about her? And a lot of times people are so affected by diet culture that automatically it comes from a place of self-hate. Automatically, the only reason why you want to do something is because you don't like the way you are. It's because you are comparing yourself to another woman, and that's how you want to try to emulate that person, but not in a positive way. And because of that soundtrack, it's like, I have to do this. I have to get it quickly. I have to, you know, do everything. Like it can be create this very extreme mentality. Whereas when we approach this from a place of gentleness, of curiosity, and of more compassion towards ourselves, we can recognize the pain within us of how we do feel insecure, how we do feel vulnerable, and how all of these things affect us. And recognize, okay, these things are going to come up. Like, I'm not always going to have a positive body image day. I'm not always going to love the way I look. I'm not always going to make the quote unquote best choices for myself. But how can I learn from those experiences and grow and create a mentality that helps me to thrive, regardless of everything else, of all the muck that we carry with us and as human beings? Like that's always going to be a part of us. But when that's the only thing steering our ship, that can be really, really difficult. And so giving ourselves time to reflect, giving us time to gently hold our hands, and that's where a professional can really help you, is you know, holding your hand with you, modeling what does that look like to give yourself self-compassion? What does it look like to ask yourself things from a loving way versus a very punitive, punishing perspective?
Right. Like I feel many people embark upon these diets and things frantically because it's coming from a place of, well, if I do this, then maybe I'll be a bit more lovable. Maybe I'll be a bit more acceptable. So it's not coming, it's from a positive place. As you said, it's more from the negative, right? It's of seeking to belong in a way, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And you know, I relate to that so much in my own journey. You know, I don't know if you can relate to that, but just that pain. And sometimes we do need pain to grow. You know, there is a part like pain is a symptom. Pain tells us things and it's a message or to us, like what is underneath that pain and how can we use that to grow? But at the same time, how can we hopefully evolve past, you know, creating these pain cycles and evolve to create a new story, a new journey. And that's where I found that Islamic perspectives can really help us zoom out of like, what is the bigger purpose? Like, why do we eat food? Why do we need to take care of ourselves? Like, what is the bigger purpose? Because I feel like there's such a gentleness in it, and that helps take away some of that like perfectionist drive, the and also the unobtainable standards that are set in society, like pack abs, and going to the gym at 5 a.m. every day and eating only chicken and berries and spinach, like these things, they're not real life. That's not relatable for most people. And for women, for most body types, to even get a six-pack ab, like you would have to lose your menstrual cycle if you're of fertile age, because of how low of a body fat you would have to get to actually see your abs. So there's so much there, that we're being bombarded with so many messages, that if we really take a step back and be like, is that really what I want? Is that really the life that is for me and that's best for me? And so I think that zooming out sometimes can also really help with the perfectionist drive, and also just being like, okay, like I have this body. Allah blessed me with this body. It's not just about me. It's not about just my feelings. It's because this is a sign of respect to Allah, that I'm going to do something every day for my body, that I'm going to treat it well and with kindness, because Allah is the most merciful and the most compassionate, and He doesn't look to our physical form. He looks to our hearts and our behaviors. So how can we align our wellness behaviors with that mentality of, how can I show up lovingly because Allah loves me? Allah loves my body. He gifted me my body. How can I reflect that in my behavior versus, I hate myself, I hate the way I look, and using that as the fire. It's like, okay, how can I use the motivation from Allah, to really fire me up and be like, okay, this is the best thing for me because this is what Allah has taught us.
Mhm. So if a person has sat down and done a very honest inventory, looked in the mirror, and I think I read somewhere that many people, they can't even look at themselves in the mirror, and that in itself is a rejection of oneself. Let's say you look in the mirror, you think about what you want. Now you have a clear picture of what you would really want, not what society tells you. Then what?
Yeah, so you have that idea. Obviously, a lot of times we create these models in our head and these visions. And what I say is, that's a point that you're working towards. These are things to emulate. These are things that our vision is the Acura. Like, ultimately, we align our choices with the Acura, our spiritual self, right? Like, how are we working towards the embodiment of these values? And so by shifting that narrative too, we're never going to actually get there, because it's the dunya, because we're imperfect beings. And to me, like, I'm a perfectionist, and that's something I've struggled with, and it causes me a ton of stress. I always have to zoom out to these things, and I think it helps certain clients as well, because it helps us reframe, like, take a breath. Because if we say, okay, I really want to be this person who I'm not yet, that can also feel catastrophic to ourselves, like as if we're not already worthy, as if we're not already lovable, right? And so just putting that vision into perspective of like, okay, I recognize like I struggle with this or that, but that doesn't mean that I am unlovable, that I'm not worthy of Jannah, that I'm not worthy of Allah's love or my own love, and that self-rejection. So I think once we also put it into that kind of boundary, then we can take the next step. And then we can look at, okay, great. So now that you have that vision in place, let's talk about the mentalities that are coming up. So we do a lot of mindset work, where again, this is really helpful to have someone coaching you or working with a professional to talk about, what beliefs do you have about food? So moving from the self and your self-esteem, what beliefs do you have about yourself, about how you look, how you feel, about wellness, and moving to, what beliefs do you have about food? What beliefs do you have about wellness? Because sometimes we can also have a very negative soundtrack, like, and food rules that can keep us really confined in a way that can be very stressful for ourselves. So that's where I would move next, is that mental piece. Because once we can also get curious of like, do we have all or nothing mentalities around food? Like, why do you feel like you have to have the perfect diet meals every day, but if you eat a Cheeto, it all goes out the window, right? Like, where does that come from? And like, how can we explore that so that you can have a Cheeto, but still have an incredibly nutritious day, and kind of work on those mentalities. Because when we start recognizing that soundtrack, then the behaviors come after. Because a lot of times we try to jump into behaviors and then it'll work at the beginning because we're so excited, or we feel we're in so much pain where we're like, we have to make this change and we have to make it now and it has to be done. And you ride that like excitement and that motivation at the beginning, but then that tapers off because it's like, okay, I've been in it for a little while, and either things can get really hard because if you go really, strict on yourself, it's a lot to maintain. Or maybe you miss that like dopamine hit of like doing something different. And then when that wears off, it's like, why am I doing this? And so when you start to explore mentalities, you can come up with understanding your big why, which will help you show up for yourself for the long term and in a way that's sustainable for you. And coming back to this idea of bio-individuality of like, what works for you might not work for the person next to you because you're a mom and the lady next to you isn't, because you have a chronic illness and the person next to you doesn't. And there's so many factors to take into play. And but once you start getting curious and dissecting your beliefs around wellness too, then you can create an experiment with wellness behaviors and figure out, okay, this works for me. I'm going to continue doing this because you're like, okay, I can see why. I can see how this benefits me long term, and really build the skills too of like, okay, I'm falling off track. That doesn't mean I'm going to be off track forever. So what? It's okay. Give yourself a little bit of a break, versus like, I'm throwing in the towel. I suck, like, and then you wait a couple months and you're like, okay, let me try another diet, or let me, like that very like hot or
Yeah.
cold mentality versus like creating a lifestyle where you find the things that are enjoyable for you. And that can also change throughout life too. Like, depending on the season, maybe you like walking outdoors when it's warm out, but in the winter, what kind of activities are going to be helpful for you? And same with food. Maybe in the summer, you love fruits and vegetables because they're so fresh. But in the winter, you're like, hey, the berries at the store don't taste as good because they're not as fresh. So what are some ways you can still show up for yourself and get your nutrition in a way that works for your life and your preferences and your temperament?
Mhm. As you're talking, it's reminding me of the analogy of religiosity. Like some people, they say, okay, I'm going to be all religious. I'm going to pray my five, and then I'm going to do my sunnah and my nawafil, and it's so intense. And then they just stop doing it because it's too much and it's not sustainable. But from what I hear, what you're saying, like, you try and build up to 2 prayers a day, then 3 prayers a day, until it becomes like a lifestyle. You ease into it, but it becomes almost part of your way of being rather than just being like an intense thing and then it just fades, right? So what next after that?
Yeah, and I love that mentality, like that analogy that you just shared, because that really is it. Like, this isn't just about food and wellness behaviors, but we can see how these mentalities affect us in so many different areas of our lives. And yes, and that definitely happens with religiosity as well. And the best teachers coach us from when we take our shahada, or when we decide, hey, I want to take Islam more serious, like, okay, it's little by little. It's the little consistent things that matter. And it's the same with our health, like our spiritual health and our physical health are pretty related. It's small, consistent things that really add up to, long-term sustainability and just wellness in general. Caveat, because I love talking about nuances. There might be times in our lives where we have to take a really big step and do something big to make a change. So you never want to play that down. There are lots of different things that can happen, but generally speaking, these small, consistent things are what we're going for. And so um, there's certain things that are accessible.
Can I interject while we're
Yeah,
still on that
yeah, yeah.
analogy? Also, it came to me on the religious analogy is that to visualize, because when a person makes dua and we supplicate, it's a wish for something in the future, for something positive that we would like to come to fruition. So by extension, how you want to be in terms of your health, your lifestyle, your engagement with the world, to visualize what that is, because I think that we spend so much of time thinking about what we don't want, what we don't want to be, rather than how we do want to be.
Mhm.
So that's something that I find would be quite beneficial.
Right. Yeah. And it's like that quote, like, what is it, where the thoughts go, the energy flows,
100%.
when you're looking for the things that align with what you want versus, yeah, the negative of like what you don't want. And um, it really does make a difference. And also that idea of visualization too is like, I think too, is self-esteem, even from a spiritual sense. Like a lot of us can feel it can be a battle to think that we'll ever get to Jannah, or like be worthy of Allah's love. And so that in itself, like when you start to visualize, like when you read the Quran and like hear the examples of like these are real tangible things, like green silk, like what does that feel like? What does that look like? And what are the things that Allah says that we need to do in order to get there, right? And then think about how can I align myself with that? But a lot of times we internalize messaging where it's all or nothing. You either have to be perfect or it's over, like what's the whole point, right? So that's just a side note because I think again, these mentalities are we can see them in patterns around our lives of like all or nothing behaviors, throwing the towel in, thinking I'm not good enough, and also using that to fuel behaviors that aren't necessarily helpful for us and that might keep us stuck. But also just to shift it to like some things that are accessible, thinking about like small things that you can start doing. We talk a lot in health coaching about adding in. So instead of thinking about all the things you need to cut out, like, there's so much in the media about cutting out sugar, cutting out carbs, cutting out, maybe in the 90s, it was cutting out fat, right? Like these trends that come and go. But when you think about how can I actually add nutrition in and what are the opportunities I have to have more vegetables or have more fruits or have more whole foods. So I like using the example of even like homemade ramen, right? Something that's inexpensive. It's accessible for most people because you can get at a convenience store. You can still make that a nutritious meal. There are ways that you can modify what you have so that you can lose this all or nothing mentality. Because usually ramen is like de demonized as like, "Ah, I would never eat that, like it's processed, it's high sodium. It's okay. Like, how can we look at it in a way, like if that's what is available to you, can you get some frozen vegetables? Like if you are at the 99-cent store, they sell frozen vegetables. Can you add in some frozen vegetables to that? Can you add in some chicken or some tofu or some protein or some edamame, something to add in protein, right? Like where are these opportunities where you can add in? Because when we start doing that, it's like that idea of looking for the positive. And you start seeing that more and more of like, oh, like I can eat a brownie and enjoy it, but that doesn't mean I can't do other things. It doesn't mean I have to eat the whole brownie tray anymore. Like you give yourself permission to enjoy food, but also use it in a way that is really helpful for our bodies and our spirits. And something that's also really accessible to anybody that you can start doing now, in terms of like our food behaviors and how we show up around food is also relying on our spirituality to help us get out of the all or nothing perfectionist mentality around food, is saying Bismillah and Alhamdulillah and looking for the positives of whatever food you have access to. Because I think a lot of times too, we get messaging about food that isn't always accessible for most people. Maybe if you have a lot of money, maybe if you have access to a trainer, maybe if you have access to a nutritionist or people to help you clean your house or cook for you or take care of your kids, that will give you more time to prepare more food, then those messages become more accessible. But for the average person that's on a limited income, that doesn't have a lot of support, it can be really hard with the type of messaging that we get around food and wellness. It can feel very out of reach and not realistic. So I like thinking about food out of gratitude, because when Allah talks about food in the Quran, he talks about it as a test for gratitude and like as a sign for us. Like if you're in a time of prosperity, if you have food coming in to your country from every direction, are you going to be grateful? There are people before you that had a very similar situation. They were very prosperous. They had big trades, but we destroyed them because they didn't think about the bigger picture of God and the bigger picture besides themselves. And so thinking about these messages, like food is also a test for us in that sense of like, can we extend gratitude towards it? Can we say Bismillah and Alhamdulillah when we eat to bring back some mindfulness of like, this can be taken away from me? We see that around the world right now. There are people starving for different reasons, whether it's man-made forced starvation or if it's because of an ecological condition. But food is a gift. And a lot of times when we're in a culture that demonizes so much food, it can really start messing with our mentality, because there are people that would love to eat any food, and have any nutrition. And so saying Bismillah and Alhamdulillah and looking for like, okay, like what is the food in front of me? What are the choices that I'm making? And how can I use that to better my relationship with Allah? Okay, maybe I can't afford, to buy everything organic or get those marketed superfoods, but I can afford some carrots and some potatoes and maybe some spinach and some chicken, and alhamdulillah, like that's a perfect meal right there, right? Like you're getting a lot of different ingredients onto your plate. Those are all nutritious in their own way. So looking for the good in what's in front of you. And if you have fun foods, like if you have Cheetos, if you have uh cake and cookies, saying Bismillah, alhamdulillah can also help us like create a new mentality around it. Because if we're so strict with ourselves where we avoid or can't ever have the food, a lot of times in people that struggle with binge eating, we tend to see all or nothing behaviors around certain foods. And this goes back to like food rules and exploring like this idea of like, do you allow yourself to enjoy foods for the fun of it? Food, we eat emotionally for many different reasons. And so joy is one of them. Comfort is one of them, but it's about building mindfulness around it and saying alhamdulillah, like, oh, that was delicious. Like, I'm glad I had that experience. And moving on from there. So I feel like with all of this though, what's accessible, coming out of this talk today, you can start looking for the positives of the food on your plate. You can start thinking about how can I make a meal more well-rounded, right? And how can I start getting curious about my mentality and how I show up for myself?
I think that's a beautiful reminder, because if you look at many theistic traditions, traditionally people would sit around a table and say grace. And for many of us, we just say Bismillah and then shove food into our mouths without actually any consciousness. And one can eat like the most healthiest organic meal, but if you're stressed out and you just really anxiety, the kids are all over the place, and you're just feeling like you're not peaceful, that meal can become poison to you. It might not even be healthy anymore. So I think it's a very good reminder to actually take pause, sit with your family, or even if you're alone, and to say meaningful prayer, maybe put a hand on your stomach, bless the food, thank the food, thank Allah for this abundance. I think it's an excellent reminder. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you that you have a story from your personal life or from a client where there were certain behaviors that they transitioned and there was a very positive outcome from that.
Yeah, so yes, I've been on a journey myself, my adult life with food, but thinking about the first person that comes to mind is one of my clients, and I'm going to share something, and it's tiny. It's tiny. But it's one of those aha moments that for her just made everything click. And she was just like, wow, that's it. And so it might not, like, it sounds so mundane and so small, but I think what we all need to look for are those little aha moments of like, oh, this is how the pieces fit together in my life. It's not about this huge magical transformation that can happen, right? But when we're talking about these small things, that can really give us access to much deeper parts of ourselves and also everyday parts of ourselves too, like the unsexy stuff, the stuff that isn't glamorized because it's not a huge, whirlwind transformation. But okay, so here's the story. So we're working on her lifestyle, and this was during the pandemic, and she was starting to go back to the office. And so she was explaining, we've been talking about nutrition and different ways to get in different foods, beliefs around food. And so she was saying how she went to the office. She was a little pressed for time, but she wasn't really hungry, but she grabbed a big blueberry muffin. There's nothing wrong with a blueberry muffin. There are positives of it, and they'll affect our bodies in certain ways. So this isn't to demonize a blueberry muffin, but what we were talking about, we were like, okay, so why did you eat that blueberry muffin? What was going on in that moment? So she was talking about how, she's stressed at work. There was so much going on, and she needed a little pick-me-up. And granted, we all do, but when we coach around like this idea of like moments of choice, like you're standing at the refrigerator deciding what to eat, what are you going to grab and why do you grab it? On different days, that's going to look different. And when when you need different things, it's going to look different. So for her, she had this aha moment. She was like, she went into her body. She went back into that moment of time when she was sitting at her desk at the computer. And she just had this wave of like realization and understanding come over her and be like, I didn't need that blueberry muffin. That was completely out of habit. What I needed was actually to comfort myself and to say, like, to give myself a little bit of break from work. And she comes to mind because like her response in the moment was just like I literally saw the light bulb go on over her head. And this happens a lot, like where it's just like these tiny things completely change how you relate to yourself moving forward. Because after that point, she was able to give herself a moment of pause, like, and reflect, okay, I'm sitting down at my desk. I'm about to eat. Is this actually what I need to do at this point? Can I go and sit outside my desk and have my lunch elsewhere, to create more of a space between work and what I'm eating? Or do I need to talk to a friend? Do I need some water? Do I need something else? And food is kind of just like my go-to thing within reach and how I'm using it. And so after that point, she had that moment of consciousness around her actions. And that was just what she needed. She just needed to go back into that moment because in hindsight, like when she was relaying the story to me before we explored it, there was such self-blame. There was a lot of stories she was putting onto that little muffin. She was very upset that she ate it. She was like, it's not very nutritious and like all of these things. And so we just took some time to be like, okay, so why the muffin? Like, were you actually hungry and you wanted the muffin? That's okay. But she wasn't actually hungry. And so she had internalized that and started hurting herself emotionally instead of giving herself grace and learning from it. And so, um, yeah, that's what comes to mind when I think about my clients is like those little things add up to just so much consciousness in our lives, to break out of those habitual routines and to break out of those habits of how we speak to ourselves. And, as I said, it's not big to anybody else, but for that person in front of you, it's like, wow, it's more than a muffin.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes. Do you have any closing words of advice for our community?
Yeah, I think for our community, for women, for Muslimas, it's so easy to say, like, be kind to yourself, go slow, do these things. But starting is kind of really hard, starting the process. So I would say, be easy on yourself, but what can help is really taking a breath. I think breath is so important for all of us because it can help us regulate ourselves and gives us a moment of pause to be like, wait, how am I speaking to myself? What kind of thoughts am I having? What are the choices I'm having? And it's something that's tangible. It does take practice, obviously, to even like become aware of it, but always remember we have choices and we have a moment of choice where we can breathe and we can decide and we can always reevaluate. Even if we're in the middle of a choice and we thought we were going one direction, we can always be like, okay, wait a second. I think what I actually need is this. When I actually tune into myself, when I take a breath, when I think and connect with myself and slow down, the answers come eventually.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you and your family all the best. May Allah bless you all.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And I wish the same for you.